Hello, and welcome to episode 92 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Today we have a guest with us, Dr. Attilla Hallsby. We mentioned this previously. We're discussing primarily this case as we revise and reshape kind of this third theoretical product. We've kind of been gravitating towards these cases that, we didn't want to sort of in advance slot them into known rhetorical categories because that has its own sort of, connotations when we say, well, this is what it is, and then we can kind of demonstrate that. It seems like, we're kind of lapsing into the sort of stuff we explicitly want to avoid surrounding the discourse of artificial intelligence, the sort of predetermination about what artifice is, about what intelligence is, and the impetus to sort of resolve that, right? Is this truly intelligence or not? Those are the kind of things we want to avoid. So we're struggling toward a mechanism to try and produce something helpful, but ideally avoiding some of those pitfalls that we're already identifying in this discourse. So we've been looking at these different cases, including the one we want to focus on today, where, sort of, and Nathaniel, I'll turn this over to you here, but sort of the center of this is a write-up about a child who, as part of a homework assignment, when working with I believe it was his father, was sort of explicitly and implicitly prompted to write like a machine, right? So there are these mechanisms like, well, it's going to be examined by an AI, and so we have to sort of write to suit its preferences. And this kind of opens this whole discourse of what that is, of what artifice is, about what authenticity is, right? And this parallels a conversation that we've been tracking about the nature of authenticity and artifice in language. Last time we touched upon a case where a human language project says it has to shut down because the internet has become so polluted, and I believe that's the language they used, with AI generated material, that it's just not meaningful to try and track human language. And of course, for us, that's a complex question because, the non-humans there are part of that context, right? You can't say this is inauthentic online speech. I mean, this is part of it, right? Trying to trace out, well, what's the human there, in a sense, ignores these other forms of imbrication that humans have with tech, right? And this tracks with things like our chess case, where it's easy to say that person's cheating. They have anal beads inside them that is signaling them chess moves. It's hard to say that person is cheating. They've been practicing with a chess computer for 20 years, right? So anywho, we see these intersecting threads, and like a lot of these, it's just sort of a sweater where you pull on a thread and it kind of unravels. So we've definitely thought about having other folks, as is par for the course with this project, kind of guide where we're going with this.
Yeah.
So Nathaniel, did you want to pick up the ball and run here?
I will do my best. Yeah, so partially what's about that particular case study is the other thing we're sort of responding to also is the instinct for transparency, right? Like the way we can finally get at artificial intelligence is get to the core of it in some way, right? There's the piece we read about making transparency the approach to AI, and the critique of that, right? Because it's going to ignore power dynamics, and it's a kind of technocratic, sort of apolitical solution to the problem of AI. And so what's interesting about that story, right, is the immediate impulse is to figure out the system, and then it sort of branches out to then playing with it and then thinking through the dynamics of it. And then we could also then talk about, right, the power dynamic of this particular artifice, like the artifice in which the student comes to write the way that they write. And so this is why we have our guest Attilla. Recently, the piece Copious Void Rhetoric is Artificial Intelligence 1.0, which my first skim through it, I was like, damn it, we've been scooped.
Mhm.
And then my second response was like, this is really helpful, because it's thinking about, right, what thinking rhetorically in particular brings to the question of artifice. Right. So you write that ultimately our uncannily this is our uncannily familiar situation. It is because certain features of AI are so evidently rhetorical that rhetoricians are well equipped to speak of its many exigences. Um, and so really thinking about this is part of your earlier remark, Jeremy, about like writing a piece that's useful, right? And coming up with a way of writing about, even, right, Attila, part of our discussion is this actually is the difficulty we're facing with this actually figuring out how to write about this, right? How to write about AI in a way that doesn't aim ultimately for a kind of unpacking who's that's driven by an act of transparency, but a way of writing about artifice that allows us to not be, I don't know, embarrassed or ashamed by the artifice, and how that writing the artifice as a way of sort of tracing these things out. Because one of the things that we've noticed is intelligence that artifice seems to be embarrassing for everybody involved, right? There's either this sort of humanist response that sees it as artifice as opposed to not real, and
Mhm.
then there's the people working in AI that are embarrassed by artifice insofar as they're worried about things like model collapse, right? That the idea that you can't just build the AI and set it loose, the idea that you have to keep feeding it stuff means it's not actually really intelligent, which to a certain extent, right, is still ideally you could transcend the artifice and it would be in and of itself intelligent. Yeah, and so we're just kind of wanting to think aloud with you about that case study, insofar as we think, given your piece, we're sort of copacetic in the approach, right? That there's a way of 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 taking the artifice seriously, as rhetoric, I think, historically has done, and then our instinct is that that provides us maybe a new way of talking about these that doesn't immediately jettison the artifice and try to get at what's really going on, which begs a whole bunch of questions. So I we sent you the piece, and so I guess thoughts, and we can talk from there.
Yeah, well, thank you both for having me on this podcast. I'm really delighted to be here and to be talking with you both. And I'm happy to take a an attempt at talking through some of the ideas, the complicated ideas that you brought up, and especially this case study about AI checkers. I'll try to like be brief and hit on like a couple of the points that you just brought up. The first is like about, I have some thoughts about the dialectics of artifice and authenticity, right? Because it does really feel like that's where it's easy to get caught up in terms of saying that on the one hand, there's this artificialness, this fakeness, this uh, this lack of genuine communication that is fostered or intensified by artificial intelligences, and especially artificial intelligence enabled writing. And that certainly comes out of the example that you were providing. And then there's another question, which I think, Jeremy, you articulated, which is that how do you really tell the difference between authentic human speech when human speech itself is already technologically enabled from the moment that rhetoric intervenes in it, right? And I think that part of the reason why I wrote, one of the ways that I talk about artifice in that article is by drawing attention to the fact that artifice has always been internally split or internally divided, or this very fraught concept. One of the reasons why is because the very word that is used in rhetoric, in order to talk about the proofs that come from an orator alternates between the word artificial and artistic. So sometimes, like this is what every public speaking student knows. Ethos, pathos, and logos are the artistic or the, less often translated but still correct artificial proofs.
Mm-hmm.
And so that negative connotation isn't necessarily associated with artificial in some historical contexts. And it's that notion of artifice that really carries through the Western European history of rhetoric in particular. It's that notion of artifice also that, is recaptured by the preference for generative over artificial in the description of AI. because it captures an inventional quality or productive quantity, right? As opposed to something that is not authentic. And I mean, that in of itself is part of that hype apocalypse, hype cycle of artificial intelligence too, to choose and select which terminology that folks really want to lean on in order to either amplify or deflect attention away from what the technology is doing in other realms of life or death. So, that just some opening thoughts, artifice and authenticity in particular. I think that, because the essay in particular embraces a kind of deconstructive mentality, it wants to maintain the tension between those two opposing senses that are inherent within the word artifice, rather than getting caught in that dialectic between it's like, what is artifice, what is authenticity? Because there are situations in which artifice has meant something other than what it currently does. The second thing that you mentioned, I'm glad that you talked about transparency. You know, um, most of the things that I've written up until this point have been about secrecy and transparency specifically, rather than about digital rhetoric. And so transparency is something that I also have like a close sort of relation. And there are moments, like certainly outside of the context of artificial intelligence, when transparency quickly falls into its opposite. When transparency becomes, for instance, a way of obfuscating by producing a huge volume of information that cannot be sifted through. When transparency becomes an obligation to make oneself visible or to denude one's, personal identity. Transparency, is something that companies like Meta capitalize on, insofar as that, there's this injunction to make yourself transparent, make yourself visible, make yourself into a transactable commodity on social media. And
Mhm.
so, transparency, insofar as it has this sort of universal value, but, you know, theorists like Edouard Glissant would say that, rather than a right to transparency, maybe we should be thinking about a right to opacity, a right to keep oneself apart, as opposed to a demand to make oneself visible.
Mhm.
Um, in the context of AI, it's particularly complicated, and this is the last thing I'll say. I know I've been chatting for a bit here,
Oh,
but
no, no.
um, there's this, you know, there's an additional series of layers that comes along with the black box of the LLM and the other the systems that go into the artificial intelligence, right? Which is that black box in and of itself is prohibitive in terms of being able to open the hood, and engineers may be the first to actually say this too. And so there's this weird Gorgian argument that happens there, which is that, we can't know what's in the box. But even if we could know, we wouldn't tell you. And even if we did tell you, it would be an incomplete answer because it really has to do what, So there are these, there are these thresholds where it becomes increasingly difficult to buy into the claim of full transparency without knowing very specifically what it is that they're referring to or talking about, or what it is that is being demanded when we're asking for transparency from these systems or from their developers. So, yeah, the my 2 cents so far.
No, that's and I so first I think I want to come back to the last point, but I that you noticing the shift from calling it artificial intelligence to generative
Mhm.
is I'm now sort of retroactively noticing that now. It's gonna be like the number 23. I'm gonna spot it everywhere now. Um, is a really interesting shift. Um, yeah, but the interesting discourse around transparency, I think, is been something that we are, by virtue of what we've been reading, talking about more, but really interesting in the context of the work that Turkers do in terms of
Yeah.
just like tracking their work and things like that. Um,
Well, very much. I mean, a finding we've had in the first two pieces has to do with what we call telling, drawing from the language of poker principally. But what we were seeing is, yeah, for humans to have value within the mechanical Turk system, they have to, as you allude to, make themselves visible in particular ways, right?
hmm,
And what we were seeing is a lot of those visibility mechanisms are tied to things like trauma, right? In order to for that to have value, you have to lay bare your trauma so that it can
Mhm.
be understood on an aggregate level. And that's something that we found humans were still valued for. They can suffer in ways that, the machine can't, right? So we need you to tell us about your cancer experience because that's something the machine, I'm sure it could tell us about it, but we would feel a gulf where it's like, yeah, but you didn't get cancer, right? The person got cancer, the machine didn't. So yeah, like we've kind of noticed that idea of transparency and visibility and a right to opacity. As we in our previous pieces, there was the idea of being visible is fraught.
Mhm.
It's valuable, but it's also there we have a piece that's like the title of it is literally I had to relive the worst day of my life on Mechanical Turk for 50 cents or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think also off of that too, generating transparency. So one of the things we found is that a lot of these human intelligence tasks were either, it's why we went with not trauma because we didn't feel equipped to go down that channel. But a lot of it was either tell us something you have felt or sense something that we can't. So it was this mix of like, tell us your trauma and help us read this crinkled receipt.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because those are right, like we can't get into you, and we also need you to get into these otherwise, right? I mean, it's similar to the captions we all do. We're basically teaching a bot how to look. Um, yeah, so there's that, and then I think the other thing about the engineers, right? Like the engineers not being able to even, right, and even thinking of like the stuff that Hales has done on computer mediated training, right? Where it would be impossible to ever actually unpack this, forget in the moment ever.
Mhm.
Um, and partially our interest too is going back to the end of this is even if you could, it
Yeah.
wouldn't resolve most of the questions we have, right? Like if you actually knew fundamentally that this was intelligent, that still wouldn't help us decide about how much content moderators should be paid in Kenya to make sure that ChatGPT isn't toxic.
Mhm.
Like that, just so that's why I think also our instinct in engaging at the level of the artifice, which as you point out, right, also then gets us into thinking about in particular, I think, artful decisions that are being made within that artifice, right? There's a sense in which aiming at the sort of transparency of the mechanism leaves unexplored the rhetorical or political dynamics that are bringing that, right? So even if we could figure out what's causing this AI detection to give this student's essay a 17% AI, right? I guess we could figure that out. It wouldn't help decide should the teacher be using the AI detection tool and
Mhm.
compelling a student to write a particular way, right? That engages that then has to become a rhetorical conversation around competing values or things like that the artifice, I think, um, yeah.
No, one of the phrases from this article that really stands out to me is who is it? The congressperson um who was saying that this is a nerd harder policy, right? Like create better grammar checkers or better AI detectors because like this is basically incentive to prime the Silicon Valley machine to be more innovative or um to allow people to come up with more and better technologies. And so
Yeah.
we're going to write that into policy instead. And nerd harder in this context means surveil harder. Figure out how to create a more comprehensive way of detecting and checking, right? And feeding this, double, this serpent that is literally eating its tail, where AI detection becomes better, and then the AIs then become better themselves, and the loop goes onward. And there's this weird myth of infinite progress that is built into that story as well.
Yeah.
But I think that in and of itself, Nerd Harder was, like you were saying, Jeremy, a kind of tell, right? A
Mm.
kind of like a way that policymakers or that developers end up telling on themselves. And I think that, there is something to the the demand from many folks to just have a right to refuse AI. And I think that the rhetorical question is on what grounds, or how is it that we leverage that claim at that point most persuasively or most directly? And most of the times, when folks are telling on themselves in that manner, it is, I think really concentrated on the specter of death in the relationship to AI, the death of creativity, like it talks about in this article, the death of labor practices, or the ability for people to be writers in rooms, right? That where they would be able to represent diverse points of view because, that experience has already been taken and then input and then reproduced automatically over and over again. And that register of death plays itself over and over and over again. I was recently at a conference in Copenhagen, where Joanna Hartelius was talking about Midjourney. And one of the things that really struck me there is that Midjourney is a reference to Dante and the passage through the depths of hell, right?
Mm.
And so like those things, those tells are everywhere. And like you said, it's hard to miss them once they come into our field of vision. And so I really like that metaphor of the tell particularly because it goes to the other word in artificial intelligence, which is intelligence, which, is literally reading between, right? And it's this way that, it doesn't just read between human discourse and then produce its own discourse. It encourages us to read between also, and that in itself is a rhetorical practice. So,
Yeah.
yeah. uh,
No, and
I
it's
don't
also
know if I answered or addressed it, but yeah, go
no,
ahead. Sorry.
no, because it pulls out, right. The other interest we were interested in telling is we're pulling from the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who also points out the sort of double valence of telling, which is I can tell you a story and I can tell that you're upset. And so it's this constant sort of that these sort of receptive acts are also generative acts, right? That even the distinction between sensing and actuator, right, that get folded together in that, which I think right maps onto I think a lot of I think even you pull out right the way I think there's I think a general sense among some academics would are just like LLMs are just like, yeah, this is just proof of concept for post-structuralism, right? Like the idea of the way that language itself, that sensing language is also the generation of language at the same time, right? That we're always telling in both directions. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's, I think, also a kind of way to think about that work of telling is itself always situated in particular ways. But also, right, as you point out too, the way that I mean, our project was originally grounded in the fact that like, we cannot believe that Amazon called it mechanical Turks, right? Which is the mythology of the person inside the cabinet, which I think you're playing on absence and presence. I think also fully plugs into that, right? The sort of sense in which who's where, and the idea that the guy that generates it, right? That the mechanical Turk was also a performance, right? He would take the cabinet out and he would turn it around and he would
Show.
open the drawers, right? Look, there's nobody in here, right? And so it was all the idea of generating this illusion. And we also learned we had a historian on, Minsu Kang, who also reminded us that it's probably not correct to call it a hoax
Yeah.
insofar as most people back were not fooled, right? In the same way that we know that the lady has been solved in half. It would be weird if someone looks back and refers to David Copperfield as a famous generator of hoaxes.
Right.
Um, but because right, but partially what he was able to generate the effect is the absence and presence and the way of how to create the audience so they were then primed or sensed or sent or sensitized to this particular operation. Um, and so the fact that these companies seem to lean in to this, in the same way that a magician, right, sort of does the misdirect, right? Like, no, I'm gonna tell you I'm doing a magic trick, and then I'm still gonna make the magic trick work. So, and of course, the other name for mechanical Turks is they call it artificial intelligence,
Right. AI.
which made us even more excited. Like two rhetoricians discover it's called artificial intelligence. We're just like, oh, this would make Plato so mad. We loved it. Like this would, you know, in the sense, the more we thought about it, right? The idea of even if historically you could actually point out that a lot of people would describe rhetoric itself as just artificial philosophy, right?
Mhm.
It's right in the sense there's the ideal form and then the apparatus rhetoric would generate around that to either mask it or hide it or make it present. Um,
Yeah.
is interesting. So as you can tell, we have a heart. We chase a lot of shiny objects and then figure
Yeah.
out 92 episodes later. Okay, so what is that? What is other than making an article that's just showing people we found all these shiny things, we think they're connected in some way, and you should be interested in them. That doesn't strike us yet as a thesis.
Mhm.
That is what crows do, of course.
It is, which is us.
Right. Yeah, that's and that notion of the deception of the mechanical Turk is interesting because it reveals different degrees of like complicity in it, right? Like when Minsu Kang said this wasn't the Dark Ages, people weren't, fooled by this probably. I'm sure some were in the same way that I'm sure some people are fooled by magic tricks, but they went there knowing they were going to see something neat. They were going to see an illusion, which means I mean, it's like you're participating in this construct as an audience member as well, right? I mean, it's like it
Mm.
it's it moves away from the notion of like, read or an audience. It is taskscapey where it's like we're all participating in this, right? I mean, we all are part of this deception or whatever it is. Collaboratively, we're generating this all together with the human and non-human parts.
Yeah, I wonder if that has me thinking, right? The idea of one of the benefits of artifice is it at least allows us to acknowledge the ways in which we're a part of it. Whereas if you see it as a tool, right? Like I can pick up AI and use it. And if I'm not using AI, I'm no longer interacting with it. But maybe the acknowledgement of the artifice in the magic trick is well, and we kind of know, right? Like we are in like every, as we're basically learning. I think we were talking about this a couple episodes, right? Like essentially LLMs have overnight monetized everything on the internet, right? Everything now is valuable, right? And Reddit's trying to close the barn door and enter into exclusive contracts, right? And you can kind of see right now, 10 years from now, you're going to have to actually buy the better search engine that can actually search the whole internet because the internet will then silo itself off to protect, right? You also don't even need to produce good content, right? Because it's all as long as you made it, my shitty YouTube video is as valuable as a well-produced one because it's still the gold dust of,
Yeah, it's human.
unique human content, which is also, I think, the and another I think it was Antonio Bird's piece about one of the ways you can get students to think about interacting with AI is to remember that every time you write something on the internet, you were teaching an LLM, right?
Mhm.
So if you're now part of the artifice, right, that what you it's the Ted Chang's life cycle of software objects. Like we're actually all participating in raising it, right? Like AI is being raised in these like creche like scenarios where it's unclear who its biological parents are because we're all collectively raising it, and we appear to be both spoiling it and not supervising it well enough.
Well, and to ask maybe a follow-up question then, and to return to that notion of opting out or secrecy,
Yeah.
what is that going to what is that going to look like? Because, it seems like our ability to opt out gets, I mean, saying like attenuated presumes something, but yeah, it's like I'm reminded of all the ways. The one that popped up for me is like during the pandemic, I couldn't go to the doctor without my phone because they weren't letting people in. You had to
Mm.
scan a QR code and then they'd say, "All right, come on in." And I was like, "But what about my parents who don't carry? I mean, what are they supposed to do in this?" And it's continued forward largely after in maybe less overt ways, but like, menus and such. And it's like, well, what does opting out of this look like?
That's a great question, like, and there are, for instance, a lot of places around where I live that are non-cash businesses at this point, and it is implicitly, explicitly a measure to deter against uh, unhoused people going into businesses as well. And at that point, right, like opting out whether it's the doctor or a restaurant, feels like an infelicitous performative, like Michael Scott on The Office saying, I declare bankruptcy out loud, and then being incapable of actually, like it doesn't do anything. I think that,
Yeah.
and so I understand that criticism. I think that really what it is like, if there is a grounds or rhetorical grounds to be able to opt out or to articulate one's need to opt out, what are the grounds that we can argue for that while the aperture is still open?
Mm,
Because that's I think the framing that because otherwise it risks becoming exactly that, right? Where there may have been a very good reason for carrying your phone rather than going in person into the doctor's office in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the gateway that has been opened as a consequence of some of those policies is also that, it's going to become naturalized. And in fact, an ed tech speaker that came to our university recently basically encouraged us to naturalize it on the basis of a really flawed metaphor, saying that spoons and neckties have become naturalized over time, and so why not AI as well, right? And so the that kind of argumentation needs to be like really interrogated, especially if, like as rhetoricians, that is a lot of what we end up doing and teaching and what it is that we want to impart to the folks who are in our classrooms as well. Um, and so the one of the things that I think, I really think that participation with the system is implied is certainly the case, right? Like we are always, as you pointed out, engaging with non-human actors, that there is this way that our discourse is never unsupplemented. There is no point zero of human discourse. But that in and of itself shouldn't allow us to build a flawed analogy between spoons and artificial intelligence, right? Because the question is whether or not the kind of participation that we are gathering from our interaction with artificial intelligence is a form of interaction that we want to have or that is desirable. And so, for instance, Colin Bjork recently wrote this article for The Conversation in which he talks about two different ways that this is not desirable. One is the creation of virtual professors who basically upload their course notes and then are ventriloquized by AI that resembles them, that speaks like them, effectively displacing the need for contingent labor within the university system. And then also systems like Turnitin, which, as part and parcel of your mandatory use of the system, ask you to abdicate your IP in the moment that you submit to it, right? And so, that's those are ways that, yeah, there is human, non-human interaction, but that doesn't strike me as desirable, particularly for a context in which we want to protect the ability of rhetoric to be taught and for the kind of literacy that we want to develop, not be, well, which one of these tools do you want to use, but rather, what are the tools doing once we use them or even before we approach them?
Yeah.
And, I think that problem of presence and absence is hard coded into not just artificial intelligence, but computer technology writ large. That it is the logic of the zero. The zero is a number that is the exception to all other numbers because it alone, unlike any other number, has no value. But adding it to the number system retroactively after the fact changed the entire number system. And so that play of presence and absence it's in the mechanical Turk, it's in the number system, it's in the binary code, it's in every level at which we would think about the development of hardware, software, coding, compilers, right? Like it is. And so when we hear that language being invoked as if it is a natural law, right? Then the thing that I really am attuned to is like, how is it that the naturalness of humans' abilities going extinct is being framed around a metaphor that seems so naturalized because it is such a part of the technologies that we use on an everyday basis. Right now, I'm finishing up like a monograph, and like one of the things that you said about like the magician's trick really hit me because I have this epigraph very unpopular, but also like very, very relevant to what we were talking about from Jacques Lacan, who says the following: "What could be more convincing than the gesture of turning one's cards face up on the table? It is so convincing that we are momentarily persuaded that the magician has, in fact, demonstrated, as they promised they would, how the trick was performed, whereas they have only performed it anew in a purer form. This moment makes us appreciate the supremacy of the signifier in the subject." And taking the
Mhm.
signifier language off the back of it, it's
Yeah.
that putting your cards face up on the table doesn't dispel the trick. It doesn't perform transparency once and for all. It makes us think that the magician is in fact the master of the thing that they have built or control. And that that's where I just say no.
Yeah.
Like so to return to your question, where does refusal start? Where does it begin? It begins with, refusing the sort of mystical not authenticity, but the mystical aura that is built up around the technologist and the developer, who likens themselves to Robert Oppenheimer, and then wants to reproduce that technology in greater and greater quantity at the same time, right? Like that's where I come at it with.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's any value in just saying like I refuse because, like you might as well say I declare bankruptcy.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's that last point there is interesting to me because it seems like, and the nerd harder is a perfect example of this, that the fix for the situation that has been created by something is more of it, right? It's always, well, we need to do this harder and better. It's like, but the situation is because of what you introduced, ostensibly, right? I mean,
Mhm.
not only that, but it's like there is an alternative. I'm hard pressed to think of, there must be these cases, but ones where it's like, well, no, potentially the way to address this is to back off it, rather than, well, we just need better detectors. We need to make sure those students aren't cheating, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. That Attila, your mention of teaching writing, that in Jeremy's situation, remember when a student writes a sentence and they get to a point and like, I need the perfect word for this part in the sentence. And most of my advice is like, you wrote the sentence, just write the sentence differently so you don't then need to find the perfect word to fit the sentence, right? Like but I think that and maybe the analogy I'm working for, and maybe I think this gets back to Jeremy's, and I think yours continued interest in thinking through the term artifice and the value of doing so is that once you realize that you're in the artifice, you understand that there's now artful choices or inartful choices that have been made so that you can then I think I'm thinking too about sort of, Thomas Rickert's work in ambience or Jenny Rice's work in ecologies, right? Like that rather than think about the particular thing you've got to do in this moment, that actually a lot of the rhetorical work is being done in the artifice or the thing that you're in. And if you're not addressing that and you're only addressing within it, right, then you can only nerd harder
Yeah.
because you think the situation you're in is inartistic when it is in fact artistic. And so you could, one of the ways you can refuse is recognizing you can get out, right?
Mhm.
Not refuse, but sort of back out, or tweak it, right? I'm also thinking of Casey Boyle and I wrote a review of Keller Easterling's medium design book, where it makes a similar argument, right? That refusal actually just reinforces the
Right.
dynamic, right? That if you have a field full of weeds, you don't go pick all the weeds. You change the soil in some way, right? You don't this sort of directness where it may be that actually forms of obliqueness are actually more preferable because they're getting your attention to the things that's in the periphery that's actually doing quite a bit of the work, right? In the sense in which, right, the magician putting their cards on the table is because they just want you to look there
Mhm.
and not notice the oblique artifice that's actually making the trick work. So the refusal doesn't work, because potentially it reinforces the dynamic.
Yeah.
It also, I think to your point, good luck, right? Like more power to if you try it. But it may also be that in addition to the refusal not working, is it actually it also keeps in place the artifice you might not like because it props it up, right? In the way ways like if you want to, I don't know. Now I'm sort of some Archimedes thing I could come up with that would point out that a counterforce is actually what holds the whole thing up.
Mhm.
So if you just actually took your refusal away, would it collapse? So, or tweaking the way that you're participating.
Yeah. Um, I number one, right? Like a lot of this points back to the very writing lesson that you invoke there. It is like is one that I attribute to very old rhetorical theory, frankly. Rewrite and then rewrite and then rewrite. That is the old strategy of copia. It is the one that I learned in an undergraduate class from Deborah Hawkey, frankly, where revision and invention doesn't come about through like coming up with the perfect word or, identifying that perfect denotation or the sort of perseverating that comes with like perfectionism, but with doing and then doing again and then doing again and doing again. And one of the hazards of like just having the answer fed to you is that that rhetorical process, that artistic process is short-circuited for us too,
Yeah.
right? I also agree completely with what you're saying about the structure itself as being artifice. It's not just me doing in the writing process, and that's the little thing I have control over, but rather the larger frame that is itself like artistically constructed or artificially constructed.
Mm.
And there, like, I think that a lot of our emphasis on things like ed tech and on ChatGPT or on Claude or, any of these other writing technologies is partly indebted to the fact that this is where many of us live, right? We are writing instructors. We are rhetoric instructors. This is where, it hits us very close because these are the things that we have been trained to do, and that over and over again, we've been told that this is what we uniquely are able to offer to our students, to our colleagues, to the university, to people beyond the university, right? But that notion of structure as artifice is much bigger than that, right? Like, for instance, watchdog organizations like Witness and Media Justice talk about data centers and energy consumption, about housing applications and the way that AI is used to fill those out in ways that make it impossible for folks to find housing. And so like those are that to me alludes to that bigger artistic structure or that bigger, artificial structure that there is this way of drawing attention to it. So it's never just a matter of saying I refuse with all due respect to Emile Zola, right? Like, or j'accuse, right? Like it's never that because none of us have like the efficacy of that statement immediately becomes infelicitous. Rather, it's what do we do instead? How is it that we are conceiving of this structure? Because I am convinced that developers and users or adopters both see the technology in the same way. It's that we all know, but some people pretend that they aren't seeing this bigger picture or are enculturated to believe that it works for them to the extent that they don't want out of that larger
Yeah.
ecosystem. So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
it's interesting. I've been having similar conversations institutionally, right? Because every time our institution talks about, I kind of want to send a message to my president being like, you understand there are reasons other than worried about academic integrity that working with AI bothers faculty, right? There are other, I mean, my statement about OpenAI actually just opens up with like how much Kenyans are paid to detoxify it and how much energy it uses, right? Like
Mhm.
if you don't start by thinking through that, then you're in many ways right, that which I think is even I think alluded to earlier, right, that even the fear mongering around AI totally benefits it, right? I mean, I think there's in fact articles been made that like, yeah, no, why do you think the people that are most likely to benefit from it are the ones that are generating anxiety about it? Because they've got the elixir, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm gonna give me a month and I'm gonna develop the product that will then, it's that old 30 Rock joke about vertical integration, right? Like I'm going to sell you the chip that gives you the gastrointestinal problem, but I'm also the manufacturer of Pepto-Bismol, right? Like,
Yeah,
you know,
on
um,
both sides. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, I think, I mean, what Jeremy and I are interested in is then how does that term artifice that's circulating around here become a way to talk about, the other things it's resonant with, like frame or institution or right, those kinds of, I mean, I think the way that we were tracing it, right, I think that if one goes back and does a history of this, probably the role that COVID played in the sort of fierce way that this appears to have emerged.
Mhm.
And I'm always interested in why did generative AI become almost overnight a problem for higher ed, right? My instinct is, well, because the call was coming from inside the, right? I mean, the university's expectation about what writing is, right?
Mhm.
Being able to generate serviceable prose that can, right? It does all the things that institutionally we seem to be asking from students, right? That they're incentivized to do this. I mean, when I right now I'm teaching a class for the GTAs that will go and teach our first year writing course, and we kind of talk a lot about like I very much doubt I have an undergraduate that might want to use ChatGPT to write an essay would have ChatGPT smoke a joint for him.
Sure.
Like, what are
Yeah.
we offloading on? Like, no, well, because I would why? Well, because I like smoking joints and I don't like writing. Okay, well, maybe that's the fundamental problem. It's actually what are the desires of our students and what artifice are we creating? Like, when you realize that there's the T.R. Johnson has a book called A Rhetoric of Pleasure. And one of the arguments he makes is think about how profoundly depressing it should be to us that when you tell someone you're an English teacher, the almost universal response is they protect, like, I better watch what I say.
Mhm.
Think about how uniformly as a discipline at K through 8, we have delivered pain to such a uniform state that if you tell someone and you're an English teacher, almost everybody responds as if you're going to do something bad to them, not do something good to them. And so maybe that's why they use Chat GPT. It's probably not going to yell at them or make them feel like they're not able to write. So again, but that's a much bigger artifice. But if you're just aiming at like, well, what's
Mhm.
Chat GPT if you're just thinking about the problem with Chat GPT is the moment, as you're pointing out, when students go and start putting the prompt into it,
Mm.
you've missed all the other places you could intervene or participate, right?
Mhm.
Like I think probably the only thing we have is we have to make it so that they'd rather do it themselves than something else. But
Yeah.
that's a bigger artifice of value and the credit system of higher ed and how much time they can devote to it and right and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, and this point's been made, but I mean, it also reveals, what we're asking them to do and its relationship to automation, which reaches back to sort of our earliest steps in this project, which is what, 7 years, I think, at this point, maybe. I'll have to check the figures on that, but we're getting there.
Or you know what? Or don't.
Yeah. But the notion of like what resists automation and potentially why, right? I mean, one way to view that is like, well, what's left for the human? It's maybe a Platonic way of seeing, continual impingement upon an essential human. It's like, well, what's left for us? And we saw those kind of interesting things like Polanyi's paradox, whereas like what we call like really skilled and unskilled resist automation, right? So it's like it's very hard to perhaps, I mean, you could see it during the pandemic with who were essential, right? Doctors had to show up and cashiers had to show up. And it's like, why? It's because, there are tasks that resist automation in particular ways. Strawberry picking was one where it's like it's notoriously difficult to get a robot who can do what the human hand and greater network attached to that hand can do, right? So we saw this kind of interesting thing about what is it that the human does, and we saw that during or dealing with AI, because it's like, oh no, now students can just put my assignment prompt into Chat GPT and then they can push button it, and we had to have this discourse about like, well, maybe then that's not what we should be having them do, right? I mean, if it's something where that can happen, maybe that's not what we want them to be doing. Maybe it's, in fact, maybe we haven't really been wanting to do that kind of thing for a bit, and now it's just the stakes have ratcheted up
Mhm.
because it's feasible in different ways.
I think that that's entirely correct, honestly. I think that the stakes have ratcheted up, but a lot of the groundwork on the side of the institution, on the side of the way that we think about teaching, the way that teaching is thought about on the part of the student, or on the part of people who have that innate fear of the English teacher. Like those are the conditions that were there prior to ChatGPT, and it was almost like the activation energy was lowered at that point in time,
Mm.
right? Um, so, I mean, there's a reason why it's so easy for folks to be interpolated into the role of Turing testers suddenly, because suddenly that becomes the kind of role that intuitively fits with the way that the teaching of English or the teaching of writing has carried on, knowingly or not, with or without that actually coming from writing instruction itself. Because checking for correctness is never going to be like the preferable thing to teaching people how to take pleasure in the act of writing itself. Because I think, like Nathaniel is saying, if people find writing to be pleasurable, rather than, like understanding the kind of psychology of writing as something that can be both pleasurable and painful, like it has gravitated to the side of pain so much that suddenly we have the Xanax of writing like fed to us in the form of an artificial intelligence spot, right? Like I do think that, it really doesn't take account of that larger ecology that created the conditions that allowed this to happen in the first place. And so, I like your question a lot. Like, what resists automation and why? And I think, the pandemic once again provides a series of tells. Like, there are certain things that cannot be like replaced, and most of that happens to be the labor force. The people who are working jobs that are are indispensable but underpaid, right? Like that there's no secret, but that was the secret that we all learned with that. And I also think that there have been pockets of resistance. And so I have this sort of dream of teaching a class where we really go through from the history of Luddism, and I know that that probably has come up in your earlier conversations as well, to, for instance, the forgotten crypto wars of the 1990s, and to sort of think about how pockets of resistance have opened up from one moment to the next moment to the next moment, to say that it is still possible, as opposed to thinking about it as the sort of totalizing closure when we look at our present moment. Because there's something really powerful about telling the story of how it is that we came to the place that we are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot that's really interesting. Yeah. And yeah. And at the same time, it's like, I don't begrudge us our history, our attachment to things like grammar, because, if we look at our discipline, well, if you look at any of them, it's like it's a form of survival. And, I mean, it's a potentially a rhetorical response to be like, we're never going to get, here's what we really should have been doing all along, except in the kind of Latourian moment where it's like, oh, well, this is what we really should have been doing all along, because that's evergreen. That's what writing truly is. It's always lily pad hopping, where it's like, well, no, this is what we do now. And then the next time is like, well, no, this is what, and, it's all often framed as, well, this is what we always should have been doing. But yeah, it's like, I don't begrudge us our painful history, because it's like that's what it is. You're always feeling that need
Yeah,
that's
and
that's there.
I am also I have internalized that mentality with my own writing as well, right? Like, and I completely understand what you're saying in relationship, like the fact that we have this attachment to grammar, we have this attachment to, writing. The thing that I think that needs to be like internally refused, or the part of our own subjectivation that really is like needs to be examined, is the mentality of that is the primary purpose for the writing classroom, right? Like, where it is this carceral mentality, whether we apply it to ourselves or to others, where we must be absolutely correct. And if we aren't absolutely correct and our students aren't absolutely correct, then that's the place where we make our intervention. And there's a very practical reason for it. It's because it drives people away in the sense that, like, if we police the boundaries of writing, or if we police the boundaries of our disciplines, for instance, we say, for instance, and I say this because like this is another area that I'm currently in and thinking about a bunch, that public address, for instance, can only be this, and there's only so many things that can really fit under that heading, and we need to restrict the domain of what this area of research is, so as such that, if you're doing this other thing, well, maybe you should go to sociology, or maybe you should go to anthropology. Then the natural consequence of that is that it's going to be selective of only those people who already have an interest in that thing that I'm calling public address. And it's going to start excluding people to the point that no one's going to start showing up for those conversations as well. And so making it into something pleasurable, desirable, something that people can see themselves in is also an essential component of that, right? I think that there is a reason to teach people how to write correctly or how to write lucidly, how to take them through exercises that will make them understand that writing and rhetoric are enjoyable activities in addition to activities that really dictate norms of what language is and can be. And there is always something like the reason why rhetoric was dangerous in the first place is the fact that it was so seductive,
Yeah.
right? That it was so like there was something pleasurable to it. And so if we've lost sight of that, then in some ways we've lost sight of why it is that people were drawn to it and to our classrooms in the first place. And I spend too much time like explaining what rhetoric is to my students, mainly because that isn't part of the intellectual memory that they bring into the classroom at this point. So, I mean, I'm not trying to both sides like the statement that you're making here. But I am trying to say that there is this element of structure that goes into rhetoric, and there's this element of pleasure that also I think rightly needs to be considered as well in order to make that an invitational claim that
Yeah.
refuses ChatGPT even before they consider using it.
It's funny you should mention that. And the copy thing in your piece. So I was slated to teach was it fall? I forget. Last spring maybe. Where we used to have a class called rhetorical grammar because we're in rhetoric and someone thought that was a good name for a class. And we have to offer it every semester from right? We've all been in institutions, and we changed it to writing with style. My colleague Paul Lynch did that, and then he was the one that would routinely teach it. And then he got a sabbatical or something, so I was already angry at him for leaving and having time off, and I had to teach it, and I freaked out because it's particularly as a rhetorician and as a writing teacher, part of the chip on my shoulder is I've avoided knowing anything about grammar. I mean, I don't know what a gerund is, and I taught at them apparently, or what a zeugma was, right? Like these were my two things. Like I don't do rhetorical figures. And I'm like, oh shit. So panic attack, praying for the class. But then it hit me, right? Like, but this actually is style could be the way into this because as you point out, it's both a structure that provides joy, and it basically sort of that what style provides is an artifice with which to write. And then thinking about that, then I basically turned that class into this class is my response to Chat GPT, right? But weirdly enough, not by avoiding some of the things it does, because Copia, I think Jim Brown even refers to Copia as like artisanal computing or something like that, right? That it's very much an algorithmic kind of right, like row through the sentences, and then you can add a sentence by now, make it a chiasmus, and now you've got another vert. Like it allows you to sort of infinitely produce. So it's actually what I was afraid of it, which is it's actually this structure. It's an artifice, but it's an artifice through which one can ideally, pleasurably, or I would also just give them painful things to do, right? But it struck me as actually, it's that rhetoric's writ large response to this is it kind of already has them, and it also sort of both ands and doesn't both and because it's like no, you have to embrace artifice. Rhetoric's point would be is there's an infinite number of artifices you could engage, which I think goes back to your point, right? It's what way of being do we prefer as opposed to another one, right? And that and I think probably as we would maybe all think through that, one of the reasons that's difficult is it's hard when you realize the ground of your argument is your preference as opposed to an objective claim that now once I've demonstrated this, that now provides me the warrant to make the claim that I'm making. And the warrants for most claims are the voicing of the claim, right? Like what allows me to claim this? I just said it out loud.
Mhm.
And then you either agree with it or don't agree with it. And the more you agree with it, the more warrant it accrues,
Mhm.
right, over time. But that's a dicier prop. I think that's the other probably reason that rhetoric gets a bad rap is it's seductive, and
Mhm.
it kind of says that's seduction is the ground for most things.
Mhm.
It offered a means to power through that,
Yeah.
potentially, right? I mean, if its roots are in, the Syracuse court system, right? I mean, if they're in the Greek court system, it offered a means to operationalize that for particular ends. Yeah, I
Mhm.
have that difficulty with those conversations. Even, this is a real tangent, but like political conversations where it's like, well, how do I know wanton killing of people is worse than not doing that? I'm like, it's just because I prefer that, on a base level. I'm not sure what evidence I could offer for that other than I prefer it if it didn't happen.
Yeah. And then I would like to persuade you to prefer that too. And
Just appeal to
that's
democracy, I guess.
that's
You
that's
agree
the best.
too?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cognizant of the time, I look at my watch as if we don't all have clocks in front of us.
Yeah,
Also, my
sure.
watch is dead, so it's a meaningless gesture, but nevertheless, um, I don't know. I mean, other than it's 11, um, I don't know. Final thoughts you might have, or I mean, we're kind of thinking about what to do next.
Mhm.
I don't know.
So let me, just respond maybe to the last thing that you all said, and I can give a quick plug for something if that's okay too.
Please, please.
Um, I think that rhetoric still has the capacity to be a way of thinking about power in ways that are really productive. And a Syracusean court system is certainly a context in which power is operationalized. But one of the things I've noticed, and I don't know if you've noticed this as well, is that students come wanting my authorization or wanting the instructor's authorization to say, like, is this right? Is this correct? And if it isn't correct, then, like these systems that they're using functionally offer them that authorization instead. And one of the ways that you can give power back to students is by saying, maybe not that everything is just subjective. This class is about, just doing whatever, right? Which is something that I think all of us always are dealing with in some ways, but rather that you are authorized to say things in the style that you wish to say them, right? Like you are capable of writing this yourself, and you can be in possession of your own ability to write and do. And that isn't something that ChatGPT can give to you. It's not even something that your writing instructor can give to you, but your writing instructor can tell you that it is entirely reasonable for you to be in possession of yourself, and your power to write and express is within your capacity and control.
Hmm.
And that in and of itself isn't I refuse to use generative AI or ChatGPT, but it is an affirmation of one's own capacity to be the generator of discourse at that point. One of the activities that always goes off, like is always a hit for me, is writing encomia. My students are awesome. They write encomia to the Healy. They write encomia to Mondays. They write encomia to campus parking services. They write, I mean, like they love the idea of being able to take ideas and then creatively reframe. And that once they're authorized to do that, to engage and partake in that creative activity, they see that that is so much more enjoyable than like offloading that to some system.
Yeah.
And so my plug, I'm currently finishing up a monograph called Sovereign Settler Leaker Lie, Forms of the Secret in U.S. Political Rhetoric. And I'm talking about scandals, dog whistles, leakers, and settler detective fiction. And hopefully that will be out sometime next year, but I'm like that's what I got to plug at the moment.
Is
Um,
that sounds awesome. And is the title of that, the cadence of it suggested a Jean Le Carre novel?
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
I guess
yep.
so.
well, now I'm for sure in.
Awesome.
No, that sounds fantastic. Yeah. Thanks for your time. This has been, it's we just kind of riff, so we appreciate your riffing with us. And I think we're never it's what's useful about this project too is we're trying to learn as we go. So sometimes it makes these conversations interesting because we maybe won't know what the value of this conversation is for a few weeks or maybe immediately. And so it's really nice to be able just to sit with you for an hour and think with you. I think we were that's it's what's one of the joys of this project for us is
Definitely.
is not automating it, but just like, thinking out loud with people is a fun thing to do. And so that's the sort of, I think, performance of at least what we're trying to do. So
Yeah,
thanks
thank
again.
you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and it has been great to think with you all. I feel very energized to go into the day now too myself. So I really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. All right. We'll see you on the internet.
Yeah,
Thank you
sounds
so
good.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Oh, they.
Yep, we're still here.
Yep.
Okay,
Oh,
that was great.
yeah. That was energizing. I think, yeah, I think there's lots of, I think the nerd harder thing, the kind of participation I think is something that we've been thinking about too. Um, yeah,
Well, and partially I was thinking about the structure we talked about last time in terms of um, having the structure of the piece, right? So having
yeah,
people, like I was thinking about how to set that up, right? And particularly like if what we want them to do is focus on like this case and see where it goes or something like that, or like I'm trying to think how to set this up.
yeah. Maybe even like, I mean, kind of how we set up these conversations, right? There's a piece that they've recently done that speaks to us, and then would the invitation be, you know, I mean, even maybe this wouldn't work, but almost like add an addendum to the thing that you wrote that would be about this thing. It's like imagine if you kept writing and this was the grist for that
Yeah.
mill.
Or if not apply, loop in how would
Yeah,
this
yeah,
thing
not
square
even
with what you're talking about?
yeah. Yeah, I think avoiding the word application and just think of this as an extension of your own thinking, which could also be a way of actually like imagining that your own, you know, research agenda is itself a kind of artifice. Now, I mean, I think we even pointed this, right? Like we could even imagine these as like human intelligence tasks around like we want you to, we're the requester. Read this article and tell us what you think about it.
That's not a bad idea. I mean, we'll fix it in post, but it's not.
Yeah, but like a rhetorician intelligence task. We're going to issue some writs.
Yeah, and I think we actually have some notes about that. We need rhetorical Turkers. This is us posing
Yeah,
a kind of human intelligence task. Okay. Yeah,
yeah,
so we did.
yeah. Good.
Human-
Episode 92, still reinventing the wheel.
We got to read these old notes. It's just that
I
there's
know.
thousands of them.
There's probably a lot of, we may have already written this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's something to consider because,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
in thinking through the project, it's like, does it make sense to do that and then start identifying folks for that?
yeah,
Um, because a lot of times what we're doing is identifying folks to be guest speakers,
yeah. And now we'd be,
cannibalizing.
yeah. Well, I mean, right, that old trope, the easiest way to get a foot in the door is to already have your foot in the door. Yeah. Yeah, maybe. And I think, this is also just a reminder, I think, to get back in the habit of having guests too.
Yeah, I think the last one was Seth Perlow. I think it was
Yeah.
like maybe like 10 or so ago. So,
Yeah. Um, yeah. Let's keep thinking of possible guests.
you know, there's also no reason those have to be mutually exclusive,
No, I don't. I think we should
you
think of
know?
this. I think, bringing people who participated at A, bring them on as guests and then have them do it, but also thinking about over the scope of the project, you know, if
Asking some of the,
yeah, people that we had on for like different reasons, right? Like so we had Kegel on to talk somewhat about the ethics of that research,
yeah,
see that, go, potentially I think anybody that we've had on as a possible
I was thinking about Kegel there at the end because the notion of opting out, because right at the end of the conversation with Kegel, it kind of turned toward Amazon, right? Because of like the terminology, but then also just like Amazon as a whole. And she was sort of like, you know, I see pieces about like trying to opt out of those kinds of things because, and there was another one just in the wake of what Washington Post's last minute refusal to endorse a candidate, which in and of itself is fine, but the timing is odd, right? If you were going to do this, why not do it 3 years ago and say, we're not endorsing candidates anymore? And so the reaction was it's a subscription cancellation, right? And there was in the neighborhood of 250,000, which was a tenth of their
Wow.
circulation. And then of course that backlash got a backlash because they're like, you're only hurting the employees there because Bezos won't feel this in the slightest. Why don't you cancel Amazon Prime? And then someone pointed out it's like 250,000 cancellations of that is less than a rounding error for them.
Oh man.
But it was interesting because it was like the degree to which you're able to opt out. It's sort of Devil Wears Prada-ish, where it's like, well, I don't think about the sweater I pick. It's like, well, you don't understand that choice has been made for you
Yeah.
well in advance.
Also, I think to your point that opting out is sometimes a privilege, right?
Yeah.
So the what is it? Microsoft's Copilot, that right, if you want it to not collect your stuff, you have to pay for the privilege. So a lot of, like if you want to opt out of ads, you have to get the premium.
Yeah.
So that even opting out becomes.
And in Copilot's case, you're paying for the privilege of, in many ways, a worse experience because a lot of the things it provides, although I think it's nerding harder around this, but a lot of the things it provides when you are not, when it's complicated, but when you are giving them your stuff, so you don't have a paid assurance that they're not keeping your stuff. When you are giving them your stuff, it gives you things like a historical record of your conversations. Whereas if you are paying them not to keep your stuff, it's not there because it's assuring you it's not keeping it. So how could it keep a historical record of your conversations, right? Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, it's privilege in a lot of ways. Yeah, I mean, the notion of like opting out and sort of how these tentacles kind of reach, right? But anyway, yeah, I was thinking about her because, the way she talks about like labor practices and those kind of things. And Net's conversations about like, because I tend to locate her, more on this sort of humanist side of the spectrum about like what this kind of stuff may or may not be doing to a humanity,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Let's see. The semester is winding down.
Yeah.
I mean, it may make some sense, and this is the kind of thing I dig into to like start building the actual production framework of this because it'll require, like a technological framework to
Okay.
structure this, and then potentially we can move on to things like, or simultaneous to that, like invitees.
Yeah, I can generate a list of folks, some who we've mentioned a few times.
Past and future.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe come up with a wish list and then, start soliciting those. Yeah.
Sorry, making a note there. Okay, cool, dead air. All right.
Yeah. Well, that's good. People love that.
Yep.
Um,
This will all get fixed in post.
yeah. Okay, well then, yeah, I will. I'll let you know. Well, I'll CC you if I reach out to folks. But maybe, yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Maybe
No
start with
problem.
some new folks you want to bring on board and then work backwards.
Okay. All right. Sounds
All right.
good.
All right. I'll see you.
Take it easy.